All right, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of content we want to cover today. So we'll get started on time. So thank you for joining the NEC Society's webinar on pasteurized donor milk and prevention of necrotizing enterocolitis. We are so honored to welcome about 350 participants from about 23 different countries around the world today. So we're really thrilled to have you here and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We are recording this webinar and it's going to be available on our website, necsociety.org, in the coming week or so. So you can stay tuned if you're looking for the recording and a copy of the slides and resources that will be shared today. I did want to mention that all of our participants are on mute, just so we can reduce background noise, but we'd really love to hear from you. So if you have questions or comments, we encourage you to please use the Q&A or the chat box tools that are down at the bottom of your screen. So I wanted to begin by dedicating our webinar series. That sweet little one you see on your screen is baby Makenna, and we are honored to dedicate the fall webinar series to her. Makenna was born at 35 weeks gestation. She developed NEC when she was 8 days old, and then she passed away when she was 7.5 weeks old. And Makenna's family wants everyone to know about the risk factors that are associated with NEC, as well as the protective factors that can help to reduce a baby's chance of developing this devastating disease. So thank you for honoring Makenna and babies just like her as we work to build a world without necrotizing enterocolitis. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So this webinar series has been organized by Ravi Patel and I. Ravi is a neonatologist at Emory and has served on the NEC Society Scientific Advisory Council since 2017. And I'm Jennifer, and the founder director of the NEC Society. And here's a photo of me with my twins. And I'll share more about them shortly. Go to the next slide. So just a brief outline of what we're going to cover today. I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the NEC Society as an organization, as well as briefly share my personal story as it relates to donor milk. And then you'll quickly hear from Ravi, and then we'll hand it over to Dr. Erin Hamilton Spence. And we are planning to leave about 15 minutes for questions and discussion. Go to the next slide. So the webinar series on human milk is building off our spring webinar series that we hosted earlier this year, which focused on probiotics. So I just wanted to mention that our probiotics webinar recordings and those resources are available on our website, necrotizing.org. And we hope you'll save the date for our next human milk webinar that's scheduled for December 16th. And we're going to be exploring fortifiers with Dr. Deborah O'Connor. So I hope you'll join us then. Go to the next slide. So I think maybe many of you know that the NEC Society is a 501c3 nonprofit, and we bring together patient families who have been affected by NEC, clinicians, researchers, and other diverse stakeholders who are committed to building a world without necrotizing enterocolitis. So here's members kind of our core team. This is us at the NEC Symposium that we just hosted in June at the University of Michigan. Go to the next slide. And here's a bit about what we do in our attempt to build a world without NEC. We are working to bring together diverse stakeholders, raise awareness by elevating the conversation around this disease. We're working to drive innovative research that really matters to our patients and our families, and hoping to help improve and advocate for better care for our most vulnerable babies. That's a little bit about what the NEC Society does. November 17th was World Prematurity Day. So thank you to all of you who are following us on social media. We teamed up with our friends around the world. You see their logos down there at the bottom to raise awareness. We'll go to the next slide. And we also published a blog on our website, and the blogging platform Scary Mommy also picked it up. So you can check out our blog, and also encourage you to please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. Subscribe to our blog because it just really helps us to raise awareness and make connections around necrotizing enterocolitis. Go to the next slide. I wanted to also mention that we have an interactive donor milk map on our website. This highlights the centers that are using donor milk in the US. Right now we have about 250 hospitals or NICUs represented. So I encourage you to check that out. And if your center uses donor milk, but you don't see your center on our map, you can easily add it. There's a little form that you can click through on this page where you can add your hospital if you guys are using donor milk. Go to the next slide. I'm so thrilled that we are teaming up with Cincinnati Children's on our upcoming NEC Symposium, and this is scheduled for April 14th through the 16th of 2021. So I hope you'll stay tuned for more information. We'll open registration sometime next year, and more details will be coming in the coming months. So it's very exciting. Do the next slide. I also wanted to mention that the NEC Society recently received a $250,000 capacity building engagement award from the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and this will really allow us to drive research. And so we just ask, while you're all in the webinar with us, that you consider sharing with us what research questions the NEC Society should prioritize and consider addressing. So if you have ideas or thoughts or questions that you'd like to share, please, you can add it to the Q&A tool, the chat box, and you can explain that this is for kind of the long-term 2-year project PCORI award that we're working on, not necessarily for Erin Hamilton Spence or one of us to answer today, but something that we can answer over the next 2 years as we go through this project. Go to the next slide. So before I hand it over to Ravi and Erin, I just wanted to briefly share my personal story to humanize the issue of donor milk and provide us with some context, just because I think my story is not unique, and I think a lot of families that have been through the NICU can relate to my experience. So when my twins, you see them there, were born at 27 weeks gestation, I had never heard of donor breast milk. I didn't know it was a thing. I certainly didn't know that human milk could potentially be a life-saving intervention for babies like mine. Our care team didn't mention that donor milk is the next best option when mother's own milk isn't available. So you can go to the next slide. Weeks later, when the concept of donor milk came up while I was talking with one of the ladies who worked in our hospital's milk room, I was surprised to learn about donor milk from the milk room and not my baby's care team. And it made me wonder what else the care team wasn't telling me about. I'll go to the next slide. And so months later, I had established a milk supply for twins. I felt very fortunate, and I was so relieved when both of my twins finally came home after months in the ICU. Go to the next slide. But tragically, just before the twins' first birthday, my son Micah died from complications of the necrotizing enterocolitis that he developed when he was 6 weeks old in the NICU. And so that milk supply that I had built up for twins, I was able to become a bereaved donor, milk donor, which I found to be an incredible gift. And so donating Micah's milk really gave me a sense of peace. It allowed me to do something meaningful and impactful to honor my son. And because of Micah's milk, I could really help to nurture and felt like I was giving life to other babies just like him, which I, of course, found incredibly fulfilling. We'll go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to share this photo because I feel like most or all of the bereaved moms that I've talked with feel the same way. We really cherish having the opportunity to donate our child's milk to other vulnerable babies that are in need. And it's a really powerful way for us to give back and honor our baby that we've lost. So this photo here is a bereaved parents in front of the memorial tree at the Mother's Milk Bank of North Texas. They lost their son, and really by becoming a bereaved donor, this mother and this family has joined a supportive community who know how to talk about child loss, and they're really eager to help families honor and remember their babies. So I think it's a really incredible gift that we can give to bereaved families. And so I'd love to see all families learn about donor milk as early as possible, ideally before their baby is even born prematurely. And I'd really love to see all bereaved mothers be given the opportunity and support to become a milk donor if they'd like. I just think that donor milk is an incredible gift, and that all families deserve to experience this really profound act of giving if or when they tragically lose their child. So thank you for allowing me to share my personal story, and I'm going to hand it over to Ravi.
Thank you, Jen, and hello, everyone. We're really thrilled for having our speaker, who I'll introduce in the next slide. But I did want to say this is an educational webinar series, and we are not providing any medical advice, and so that's just one of the disclaimers for this series. Next slide. We're really thrilled to have Dr. Erin Hamilton Spence present today on the use of donor milk. And Erin started early life in rural Indiana, and she attended college at the University of Chicago, and then really became a Texan for life after that, moving to Texas in 1996 and doing all of her medical training there. And today she's a neonatologist for MEDNAX and works in a large, thriving group practice of physicians and practitioners in Fort Worth. She became a mother the same year she became a physician, and she's really had a lot of interest in communication between NICU providers and parents. And you just heard a great example from Jen about kind of opportunities to do that regarding donor milk. And she's really medical director for the Mother's Milk Bank of North Texas, and and has been in that position for the past 10 years. And we're thrilled to have her on this webinar and look forward to her teaching us and talking to us about donor milk. And please chat in, use the Q&A box as Dr. Hamilton Spence presents and ask us questions, and we'll make sure at the end to have a Q&A session where we try to address some of your questions. So, thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming on. These are my objectives. You'll see this slide a number of times, so you don't need to know everything about it right now, but I think that we're in a real nexus of opportunity and change for those wanting to learn more about donor milk, because when I started learning about it 10, 15 years ago, there really wasn't really that hard to become the expert because no one knew anything about it. That is changing, which is a great thing. And after this webinar, y'all will know almost more than anybody else in your NICU about donor milk. I have no financial disclosures. Like Dr. Patel said, I work in level 3 and level 4 NICUs in Texas. I'm a medical director. I had a preemie of my own. My first baby was born prematurely in 2001. She's currently 18 years old and super healthy. And probably one of the relevant disclaimers is that I did provide breast milk to my preemie and all my other babies. And with regards to my own health, I lactated for 74 months total for my 4 babies, which is about 13% of my life. And I am also on Twitter if you'd like to follow. So we're going to go to our first mentee question. For those of you watching, if you have an opportunity to open up a web browser, you're going to open mentee.com, and from there enter this code 3269. We're going to wait about 15 to 20 seconds to allow people time to do that. In the meantime, I'm going to toggle over to this. So here are your answers in real time. I'm curious about the audience and who's there. I know we've got about 70 plus, 90. We've got about 90 people watching right now. And we're 20 seconds in. So if you have a minute to go to mentee.com and put in this code 326979, we'll learn a little bit more about our audience. We'll wait about 10 more seconds. All right. Numerous other interested parties. Okay. All right, that gets us started. So now you know Mentee is coming back. We'll be back there in a bit. So just some definitions. I think this is such a new field, or a field that hasn't been talked about or researched as much as it should have been. There's lots of opportunity for misunderstanding of what is donor milk. Just to begin, what is mother's own milk? Seems like a silly question, I know, but it's when a mom expresses her own milk to feed to her own baby, and is often used to emphasize the point of feeding breast milk in the NICU. just as a way of another definition, what fresh breast milk is it's never been frozen. Some fresh can be refrigerated as well. So it's either body temperature or refrigerated, but has not yet been frozen. Donor milk itself is also referred to as donor breast milk or donor milk. That is typically frozen, screened, and pooled. So there were multiple donors in a pool. Raw, that has not yet been pasteurized, previously frozen breast milk from healthy moms who have extra milk of their own. And then of course, just add pasteurization to that term. That is sometimes called pasteurized donor human milk. And that just implies that it's been pasteurized and rendered safe for feeding to somebody else's baby rather than just feeding to your own. This is typically done with the Holder pasteurization method. I will teach you a little bit about what are some of the other methods out there. Often these terms, donor human milk, donor breast milk, donor milk, pasteurized donor milk, are used synonymously. And it's good to know that there are some slight differences between them. One other point is that a mother's milk bank is actually a hospital or community organization that screens donors, collects their milk, processes that screened donor milk, and dispenses it to hospitals to feed to other babies. If you have a place in your hospital that receives mother's milk and fortifies it and gets it to the bedside, that is a milk lab, and the people who work there are milk technicians. That is a different thing than a milk bank. Just as a beginning, the framework for how to get a milk bank up and to be successful is really put out beautifully by the PATH organization. This is a nonprofit organization that is working on access to donor milk and equitable access and nutrition worldwide. There's a whole lot more in this framework if anyone wants to know more about it. Okay, so let's get into the evidence. Back to mentee. Okay, next. Thank you. We've got a lot of other interested parties. All right, next question. Which outcomes seem to be improved by feeding very low birth weight infants preterm formula? You've got about 30 seconds to answer this question. And just for clarity, I'm asking for improvement by feeding formula. I know that the wording of it is a little bit tricky, but we'll sort it out. 5 more seconds. Okay. All right. So short-term growth in the hospital is the winner there. We're going to take a deep dive into that. Next, just to flip that on its head, which outcomes seem to be improved by feeding very low birth weight infants donor milk? Another 25 seconds. Yeah. Do see a lot of people dialed into this webinar who've been interested in that. Okay. All right. Oh, not this one. Let's go back. Okay, great. Sorry. Okay. So in the beginning, which I would call 2012, the AAP put out a statement about breastfeeding the use of human milk. This was the first American Association of Pediatrics statement that mentioned anything about donor milk. It was good support. It mentioned that preterm infants should be fed donor milk, but neglected to say who and for how long and what kind of milk should it be. In 2017, AAP responded to an increasing awareness that people were sharing milk and that milk was being sold and purchased on the internet, and put out their statement around donor milk and the use of donor milk in high-risk populations, how to prepare it, how to keep it safe, and in the United States, what it was currently being used for. So those are sort of the beginning background for donor milk. The FDA does have some regulation of donor milk. Around that same time or last year, you see March of 2018, they did say that if you're considering feeding someone else's milk to your baby, you should probably get it from a trusted source, and that the source has screened its donors and taken precautions to ensure the safety of the milk. So the evidence, really the holy grail for this evidence is in a Cochrane review. And I feel super grateful to this, to the work of Quigley and colleagues who are in the UK. And they rally kind of every year now. It used to be about every 3 or 4 years, but now every year they're reviewing the evidence and updating their systematic review. So this is the summary statement. In preterm and very low birth weight infants, there's moderate certainty that indicates that feeding with formula compared with donor milk, either as a supplement to mom's own milk or as a diet on its own, results in higher rates of weight gain, linear growth, head growth, and a risk of developing necrotizing enterocolitis. And the trial data don't show an effect on all-cause mortality or long-term growth or development. So that's the punchline, but we are going to get into the nitty-gritty of that because I do feel like the devil is in the details. And if you're wondering why everyone isn't using donor milk yet to help prevent necrotizing enterocolitis, I think the answer is here. So I put the bias graph here, and just the colors show you that there is some risk of bias in the current evidence that's out there. So the largest of these being other bias, which is unclear risk of bias, but also selective reporting bias is relatively high in this collection of research. The blinding is a little bit challenging. Some of that may be because it's kind of easy to tell if you've ever fed donor milk, which babies are getting it and which aren't. Not 100% of the time, but there's certainly could be some observational bias, even with randomization. So this is the summary slide from the Cochrane review. And I'm going to delve into mostly neurodevelopmental disability and necrotizing enterocolitis. So yes, they do grow faster. Babies on formula grow faster in the early stages. The big question is, and clearly there's a reduction in necrotizing enterocolitis for these babies, even though they grow more slowly. But the big question is balancing your risk. So is your risk of long-term developmental outcome worth the risk of slower growth to prevent necrotizing enterocolitis? That's the crux of the argument. So this is a forest plot. And I suspect that a lot of you have seen something like this before, but I will march systematically through it. So first of all, this outcome that is looking at necrotizing enterocolitis. So this is sort of the marquee forest plot in this Cochrane review. And you can see to the right, there are little hints about how much bias might be contained in that specific study. You can see the timeline. So these studies started with Lucas and Tyson and Gross in 1983. So really in the mid 80s when I was a little kid. And then as you go down and the evidence gets bigger and the numbers of patients gets bigger, in 2005, 2013, 2016, there were larger studies that really added to this. So these reflect, as with these timelines, different types of practice. So in 1980, Gross had the first study about necrotizing enterocolitis prevention and whether feeding formula, term formula, versus unfortified donor milk helped prevent NEC. And you can see that the diamond is really flat. So it's very wide and the whole thing crosses the middle, crosses the 1. So there really was not great evidence from that one specific study if you're just looking at the top line. And then things that were added, preterm formula became available in the 80s, and they decided this was really a better comparison than term formula because that's not what we're going to feed these babies. So Tyson and Lucas, and then just in the last year, Costa added some evidence to this preterm formula versus unfortified donor breast milk. This is not typically a practice that happens much, at least in North America. It is really every baby in North America has a standardized fortification protocol and has to do something abnormal to be off of that. So you can see as the diamond gets more narrow, that's more babies. That's a total of let's see, over 600 babies in that group instead of just the 60 babies in the group above. So we have a tenfold increase in the number of babies enrolled in these randomized controlled trials. That also does touch the line. So while it's a better estimate, it also touches the line. So it really has a leans toward favoring breast milk, but doesn't quite hit the mark. And then lastly, so that one was preterm formula versus unfortified donor breast milk. Lastly, preterm formula versus fortified donor milk, which is pretty standard practice. So over 900 babies enrolled in these trials specifically, and these are really in-hospital outcomes, of course. And you can see that the diamond is much smaller. It's very close to the line. And if you look at the numbers, it's hard to see with your eyes, but it actually does. It's all shifted to the right of the line and favors breast milk. And when you add all of these together, their point analysis is favors donor milk over formula milk. So those are the nitty gritty of the details of what's available in around donor milk and the prevention of necrotizing enterocolitis. But growth and development matter too. So if you're someone who hasn't used donor milk, or if you are a patient of someone in a hospital that isn't currently using donor milk, really the big swing is growth and development. So as a neonatologist, I was told, and I've watched the evidence develop over the years, that if you don't grow as well, you don't do as well when you're older. And you may wonder as a parent why that matters, but we take the marathon view in neonatology. While we do some short-term trade-offs, what we're really interested in is, how is your baby when they head off to kindergarten? How much did you have to do to get them there, and beyond? So kindergarten, first grade, high school, and beyond. So this is a battery of things that are long-term outcomes that make us concerned that if you don't grow as well as a small baby, then you may not be as healthy, and you may not perform as well as you could if you had grown well as an infant. And some of this is getting to, and this is not, just to be clear, this is not a donor milk trial. I think this is important though, because what you're seeing is that there is this apparent breastfeeding paradox. So that in large population-based studies, if you get more mother's milk, you have slightly higher performance at child age. So these were 5-year outcomes on a mental processing composite score. This is the EpiPage and LIFT data combined. These are both European trials. And they did find a dose response for performance based on exposure to breast milk or breastfeeding. And you can see it's a nice little stair step, that if they did not get any breast milk or any mother's milk, those were the lowest performing children. And those fed their mom's own milk is important, but also those fed breast milk at discharge matters a lot. So the weight of performance and whether or not babies are going to perform as well as formula-fed babies when they get fed donor milk, it really isn't answered yet. And that's the crux of the question. So there's really shockingly only one very long-term outcome analysis, and it was Dr. Lucas. So one of his cohorts from the 1980s, and this is only at 18 months. So 18 months it's typically the first time point we get for these long-term outcomes, but really the later outcomes are actually seem to be more accurate for the rest of their lives. So Lucas had his in 1984. He had them as a sole diet. So if you're getting only donor milk and not any mom's milk whatsoever, or as a supplement to mom's milk, there is a trend toward favoring breast milk, though you can see that trend, that effect seems to be a little bit less if it's just as a supplement to mother's milk. So would it be better to supplement these babies with formula if they're getting some of their mom's own milk? That's an unanswered question. So to answer this question, there is currently a large randomized controlled trial funded by the NICHD whose primary investigator is Tara Kalasi at the University of Iowa. They have 485 babies, and they are getting some more long-term outcome data. And they do not have any current analysis available, but I believe in 18 to 24 months, that should be available and published. So some of that question should be answered at that time. Okay, we're headed back to mentee. Here we go. All right. Oh, we've already got all this. So are you, who among the listeners is currently using donor milk in your NICU? Some of you have already answered. I should not be surprised that that's this audience, I suppose. Okay, we have a majority, yes. Do you know where it comes from? We'll wait just a few minutes for that. Okay, most of you do, some of you don't. And then this is your opportunity next to tell me a little bit about it. Where does it come from? If you do know, where do you know who provides your donor milk? So this is a free texting option. You should be seeing some words coming up. Okay. Nice. So what you're seeing is a lot of regional nonprofit milk banks. That's nice to see. We have several, and in these word clouds, those that have larger words have had more entries. So you can see that there are a lot using Prolactin, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And several participants getting it from the New York Milk Bank, the rest of them fairly equally from, looks like, nonprofit milk banks around North America. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so it is truly dizzying where donor milk can come from. If you Google donor milk, it depends on whether you're using your location services, of course, but there's a huge array of options, and it can be very confusing. And some of this confusion is intentional, actually. I'll mention just Ambrosia Labs. They were a lab based out of somewhere in the northern part of the States. And they were buying milk from Cambodia and selling it in the United States. That isn't happening anymore. So there, as a human tissue, there is opportunity for exploitation. And I think it is incredibly important to think about the autonomy of those people and where you're getting it from and where it goes to. So donor milk is, like I mentioned before, excess milk from healthy screen mothers who are providing it to their own infants. I will give you some local data. There are some publications about who are these donors. And in general, our donors at the Mother's Milk Bank in North Texas reflect the general population. Most of them, 88%, are mothers of term breastfeeding babies at home. A smaller portion, about 5%, is of preterm. Now, there are some milk banks that have slightly higher preterm donations, some that have slightly lower preterm donations. Those are our local data. And then, as Jennifer mentioned, being a bereaved donor, that's actually, we have more of those moms than preterm moms. And in this selection, preterm moms who are bereaved donors are included in the preterm moms. So there are maybe a few more bereaved mothers than you may have thought. And who are they giving to? So either one of these nonprofit milk banks with the Human Milk Banking Association of North America, or a for-profit milk bank. And when they are trying to decide, many of them, and in some of the qualitative research, say that the idea that they are giving something away, and as Jennifer mentioned, some of the healing that occurred for her as a bereaved mother is really the point of the giving. There is a way to make money off of your milk if someone is considering giving it. And it's generally thought to be it's generally reimbursed at about $1 an ounce, up to a certain amount. So there's not a limitless amount that you can donate. So what changes happen to donor milk that are not present in mother's milk? So probably one of the best reviews was in Nutrients just a couple of years ago. And I separate these into immune and nutritional properties. This is specific to the changes that happen after Holder pasteurization. This is also called low temperature, long time pasteurization. And so the immune changes, the immunoglobulins are changed, the lactoferrin is changed, the lysozyme is changed, but they do retain some of them and have some function. And then the response in cytokines and growth factors vary. The majority of them are reduced, Every once in a while, one of them will be increased, but the majority of them are reduced. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in another slide. The nutritional content it appears to be mostly stable, but the lipid content, including the free fatty acid profile, is pretty contained. The carbohydrates are retained or at least minimally affected, including oligosaccharides and lactose. The protein, as you might suspect, is more sensitive to heat than some of these other things. So the protein is probably changed some. The fat-soluble vitamins seem to be the same, and the water-soluble vitamins, however, as you might suspect, based on heat treatment, are actually quite diminished. And I like this picture. This is, again, a publication from PATH in the Journal of Perinatology a couple years ago. This just walks you through the process. So here are the hazard analysis and critical control points for milk banking. They select a donor and recruit them, and then screen them with both their blood. And you see the little clipboard symbol there. That's a questionnaire that is typically done initially over the phone and then on paper. And then they also get permission in Humana and I believe in all of the for-profit organizations, they get permission from the primary care provider of the mother and the infant who are providing milk. To make sure that we're not the infant milk. And then they have guidelines for expressing that in a sanitary way and storing it. There's some temperature control in the handling, both at home and to the milk bank. The milk is then, we're skipping a major point here, which is pooling of milk. We won't get into those details. The milk then gets pasteurized. It is post-pasteurization tested for bacteria. Some people still test for bacteria pre-pasteurization, some don't. But the post-pasteurization testing is to make sure it's going to be safe, and it's quarantined for a couple of days before it gets out the door in a temperature-controlled transport to the hospital. And there is typically a heat analysis or a heat safety step on the other end to make sure it arrives as cold as it's supposed to be. So that's the process. Now, in the milk bank, what is happening? I'm going to give you some of the details, and there are really just two major ways to do this. There are lots more. And probably in the next decade, you will hear and maybe see some of these other processes like ultraviolet pasteurization or higher temperatures or lower temperatures that might change things. But at the present time, really, at least in North America, and I understand there are people not from North America here, I apologize about that. These are the two ways that donor milk products are being processed. So holder pasteurization, as I mentioned before, has a temperature of 62.5 to 63 degrees Celsius. It is held for 30 minutes, typically in a shaking water bath at atmospheric pressure. Its unopened shelf life is 6 months in the freezer if you have a really good freezer. And then the open shelf life is typically 48 hours. The retort or shelf-stable milk, these are the same thing. This is processed at twice as much, 121 degrees Celsius. For 5 minutes with a little bit of pressure. It's essentially, for hospital staff, you can think of it as autoclaving or similar to autoclaving. It's a very short time and high temperature with a little bit of pressure. It's, of course, there are advantages here. It's shelf stable, so you can have it at room temperature for up to 3 years. And even in the refrigerator itself, not even in a freezer, for up to 7 days. So I think one of the most important points I hope you acquire from this webinar is that all of that research that I mentioned before is done on holder pasteurized milk. So every one of those short-term and long-term outcomes around donor milk, including necrotizing enterocolitis, was performed on milk that had been processed via the holder pasteurization method. Sounds kind of silly, right? But I think that it's important education, because if you were in the early days of surfactant, if there was only one surfactant that worked, and of course breast milk is a lot more complicated than surfactant, then you had another surfactant that called itself surfactant, and it was actually a different protein, but still a surfactant. You might wonder why your outcomes weren't as good if you switched to the new, either cheaper or easier to handle or higher technology option. There isn't any proof that the outcomes that you see would be the same if it was shelf stable milk. So all of the research was done on holder pasteurized milk. So why does that matter? I guess the real question is, does the processing change actually what's in the milk? And there are some answers to that. So Holder pasteurized milk does seem to have more IgA. You can see the differences here between raw milk and Holder pasteurized milk. And then the blue, the more aqua bar is the shelf-stable milk. So the secretory IgA is greatly diminished in the shelf-stable milk. The lysozyme is undetectable. The thiamine is greatly reduced, and the lysine is greatly reduced too. So these are examples of proteins that are probably very bioactive in the immune processes that might help prevent NEC. Importantly, we don't know what it is about donor milk that helps prevent necrotizing enterocolitis, whether it's avoidance of something that is contained in formula or it's addition of some protective factor that is in donor milk. And it's probably more complicated than what you feed, as we've learned over the years. But the content of the milk does change based on how you have processed it. Okay, so is it accessible? Can you get it at your hospital? And is it available? And how much does it cost? There are a lot of NICUs in the United States using donor milk. The last large survey by MT Perrin in 2017 showed that it had increased, and this was from 2015 MPINC data. It had increased to 74% of the NICUs, and that is in line with increasing surveys throughout the last decade. And this question of whether it's available, I believe, should focus on, is there enough donor milk to go around? There were 8, 9, 10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not there was enough donor milk to go around. And I hope to address some of that concern. And then the accessible part is, does my hospital currently have access to it? Is it part of our process? Can we order it? Do we know how to store it? All of those things. Now, accessibility, I think, is really the key here. The CDC pointed out in a morbidity and mortality weekly report a couple years ago that there are pretty big disparities. Now, this was postal code data based on whether you were a high African-American population or a low African-American population, or when high being above average, which is greater than 12.3%, or low, which is less than 12.3%, just trying to split it right down there. And it is more likely that if you are in a high African-American population hospital in that specific postal code, it is more likely that you will not get donor milk. So access to milk is absolutely essential for the outcomes of all of the babies in the NICU. And then there are other people working on equitable access. PATH is one of them, and just for time's sake, I'm going to allow you to look at that if you need to. So bear with me just a minute. This is going to take me about 2 minutes to talk through this. So this is not published data. This is based on some publications and some data that I was able to get, but I'm going to walk you through this table. So is there enough milk out there? That's the real question. If in a perfect world, if things were going well, would we have enough milk to feed, let's just say in the United States, all of the very low birth weight babies? So in the United States, our birth rate is very similar to Norway. I put Norway up here just because they're the only country that has a publication about how much donor milk is given on average per donation. So that's why I'm comparing this data. So, and then in the US, they have a similar birth rate. We have, a lot more people than they do in Norway. And just at the Mother's Milk Bank in North Texas, our average donation is around 684 ounces. Given these assumptions, excuse me, let me walk through. I gotta move something. Okay. We're just gonna do some very simple math. So if we take those 75 million childbearing women every year in the United States, and we assume that 80% of them lactate, and they do. That's what the most recent data is. There's at least 80%, and in some states closer to 90% actually are making milk for their own babies. So that leaves us with 60 million women who might optionally donate. And what if 10% of those had enough to donate? That would be 6 million women who were available to donate. And if each of those women, just taking an average, with the range of course, donated 684 ounces, how many ounces would we have? Over 4 billion ounces a year. Now, if 10% of women is a generous assumption, let's change it just a little bit, just move a decimal. And instead of, there were 1% who had enough milk to donate. 1% is probably maybe accurate, I don't know. There's no data about who might be available to donate. And those 600,000, instead of 6 women donated 684 ounces, we would just move the decimal by 1 point. And at the bottom, you'll see the blue 11 million. That is the current number of ounces that are used. That is my estimate of the current number of ounces that are used in the United States. And that is based on Humana. Their data from 2018 was 6 million. Prolactin shared with me that they got 5 million ounces last year. So give or take another 100,000 or so, around 11 million ounces of donor milk are used in the United States a year. And whether it's 4 billion or 400,000, that is somewhere between 0.2 or 0.02% of the milk available that is currently being used. So I feel like there's a lot more out there. This is the Humana milk. They can see year over year, they've been able to dispense more and more milk. These are the 28 current milk banks and 5 mentoring milk banks these are all nonprofit milk banks, probably one near you, as a lot of you mentioned. Also, Prolactin shared with me I emailed various people in these organizations and got one answer. So I know that they collected 5 million ounces. As of last year, 41% of hospitals in the US were using their products. And importantly, 97% of their products, of their intake goes to their fortifier, not to their donor milk product. So their fortifier is made of donor milk. They do have a donor milk product, but that isn't the bulk of what they dispense. These other are shelf-stable milk distributors. And I know that there are some small trials, usually which I found in abstract form and occasional publication about using these shelf-stable milks. I would venture that if you're thinking about using a shelf-stable milk, that maybe very low birth weight babies isn't the population to use it in. And then what's the cost? So this was as of about a year and a half ago with some assumptions. Let's assume that this was a 1,000 gram baby who had an exclusively donor milk diet, not counting fortifier. And on day of life 2 to 3 or 1 to 3, we initiated feeds of donor milk. They attained full feeds by somewhere around day 12 to 14. They did not have any complications. Their length of stay was average around 90 days. And they discharged around 2.5 to 2.8 kilos. So the price point is quite a bit different. You can see the Humana milk costs generally between $4.40 and $4.50 an ounce, and averaged over a hospital stay for an average NICU patient. And I understand no one's really average, but just based on the numbers, if you wanted to estimate how much it costs to provide just donor milk, there is a big cost difference. And then just one caution for those of you using donor milk who struggle to get these babies to grow. There are a lot of assumptions going into it that it's just like mother's milk and your fortification pathways are the same as mother's milk. That might not be the best idea. So if you're struggling to grow these babies, take a look at some of this research around the actual content of the donor milk and know that you may need to add more fat, more protein, more calories to get these babies to grow. And then lastly, if you're interested in the ethics surrounding the use of donor milk, this is a nice publication out of the Mother's Milk Bank of Louisiana that gets into more details. That's it. Sorry for the 10 minutes.
Thanks, Erin. That was wonderful. And we'd love to hear from the audience. So please, at the bottom, you'll see a Q&A tab. You can chat in your questions or you can use the chat box and we'd love to take your questions. So, and maybe I'll start just with the last point that you touched on, which was kind of the nutrient differences in nutrient profiles of donor milk and how they may vary. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were on kind of the newer approved, that kind of recently approved human milk analyzer, and whether that has a role, either generally or kind of more specifically in how it's being used, how donor milk's used in NICUs.
Great question, Robbie. So there is an FDA-approved human milk analyzer that was just approved last January, so it's been less than a year already. This is used in milk banks to measure macronutrients, so fat, protein, and carbohydrates. That is what it measures. It is not measuring any micronutrients at this point. So sodium, potassium, calcium, selenium, none of that is measured by the human milk analyzers currently available. Those are all going to need to be done in wet labs. But I do think that there's an opportunity to use them for either mother's own milk or donor milk in a way, either at the bedside. There are a lot of milk banks that use them and that label their milk for one of those macronutrients or total calories. And that can be helpful as the end user neonatologist to know which milk you're getting so that you can build up from there. It is not universally adopted at this point in the nonprofit milk banks. So one of the appeals of the for-profit products is that they do have a more standard and less variable output in their products, so that as they will tell you that you can count on 20 calories per ounce and either something above 1 gram per deciliter of protein. So that is definitely an improvement that you could see. But again, those products are all of the shelf-stable milks. Those products haven't been used in research yet. So they're really in research, should be in small trial settings at this point.
Thanks.
I had a question for you, Erin, and then maybe you can grab the question that just came in on the chat box. Can you talk a little bit about some best practices around consenting families with donor milk, and even perhaps, I don't know if anyone is doing this, consenting families around the use of formula?
Yeah, so there is, it's changed a lot in the last few years. It used to be, before this sort of summary of evidence, it really was not it was standard practice to ask for consent for donor milk. And that has changed a lot as the evidence has grown. There are many hospitals who have looked at the evidence and decided this should be standard care. So just like you don't ask consent for which ventilator to use, you don't have to ask consent for whether or not you should use donor milk for a very low birth weight baby. So I know there are still hospitals who are consenting for one donor product like Fortifier and not consenting for another donor product, which is a little bit odd, but they do feel like there's one process that's a standard accepted protocol, and that is that the evidence makes it so. But sometimes they still consent for other donor milk products. So I do believe that it's important for families to know that you can ask for it, and that even if it's not at your hospital, there are, that this is how I've known hospitals where the parents were the change, and it was the parents asking for donor milk that, and raising the question, whether it was the first time or the 10th time, raising the question of whether or not it was going to be available to their patients. And in fact, the first time I learned about donor milk was from a mother in the NICU.
And just to tie on to that, how do you think, I mean, it seems like the data on NEC is of course the most important benefit to discuss. What do you think in terms of the discussions as you're speaking with families about donor milk regarding some of the growth data?
Yeah, so I think it's important to highlight that there may be some risk to using donor milk if in the long term if therefore they don't perform as well because they don't grow as well. I think that it's important to have both parts of those conversations. I think that from this lens, and certainly for this audience, if all of you are here because you're advocating against NEC, then obviously our audience is going to be skewed toward the NEC prevention and probably would be willing to take some of the risk for a little bit slower growth if there were worse outcomes in the long term. But at this point, that hasn't played out. So I do usually mention it, that it's important to say there may be some things about using donor milk that we don't know yet, just like a lot of the things we do. But try to be frank about this is, you know, for in the hospital, we feel like this is the safest option.
So we have a question chatted in, and the question is, what are the differences in the beneficial properties of breast milk directly fed to a baby versus fresh milk stored at freezer, and nutrient and immune-related content between kind of directly fed breast milk versus stored in a freezer?
Yeah, good question. So not a lot of great research about this. And I assume that you're asking specifically about mother's milk, not about donor milk, because as we learned, it isn't fed freshly, right? Because it's donated and screened and pasteurized. But for mother's own milk, there's not great research about it. There are certainly theoretic and biologically plausible benefits to feeding freshly expressed milk at the bedside. So live cells and growth factors and hormones that are altered by both the pumping and the transporting and the freezing and the thawing process. All of those things do get affected every time there's a transportation of the milk, or you know, it's moved from one thing to another. So there are theoretical benefits to feeding freshly expressed milk that hasn't been put in a refrigerator and hasn't been frozen, but truthfully, there isn't great evidence for this specific population around that. And there's not great breastfeeding research. So feeding at the breast, it hasn't really been fleshed out either. Probably that's beneficial, but for all of those moms pumping exclusively, I think it would be hard to say at this point. There really isn't any evidence that directly feeding at the breast is better in the long term or the short term for those babies. And then the difference in nutrient and immune related content between these two. I think that's a very broad topic. I think that there are some differences. I think there are a couple of reviews which I can add to the end of the webinar if you'd like, that can help point to some of the differences between refrigerated and frozen milk, mother's own milk.
Looks like we have another question here regarding a strategy for families that refuse donor breast milk and decline to provide mother's own milk. This is something.
Yeah, great question. So, you know, we have, I would suggest that it is, we do occasionally have a parent who is concerned about exposure to somebody else's milk. So we try to frame the conversation about the health outcomes for the baby. And, you know, like Jennifer mentioned, most people don't know, haven't heard anything about donor milk by the time they get to the NICU. They certainly haven't heard anything about necrotizing enterocolitis. So I think that it's important to use these words, you know, not as a scare tactic, but just as a factual statement. This is, there's a risk of these things that are increased if you're choosing not to use donor breast milk in your baby. And really, I try to get to the nuance behind the refusal and ask them what it is they like about formula, or, you know, is there something specific about, based on their cultural setting. They're sometimes, if you're just kind of missing the point for them culturally and you haven't understood what that refusal is about. So I usually suggest trying to, it takes more time, obviously. So if you have someone who refuses to use donor milk, you're going to need to dig into the details of that and be open and empathic. And the truth is that you don't know, you can't see down the road whether or not their baby, if exposed to formula, is going to get necrotizing enterocolitis. Things are not that clear. So I do think it's important to respect the parents' wishes and when you're having that conversation, and try to get to some of the details of the refusal and what that's about.
We have a couple of questions in our Q&A box. The first one is after NEC and after a baby develops NEC, and knowing that at some point for babies who are receiving donor human milk, they have to transition off of this to kind of a home feeding, which may be a formula regimen. Any thoughts on kind of the best formula to transition to, or potentially even at what age this transition should occur?
Yeah, good question. So our the practice I have most commonly seen and what we use is to transition when babies are past the danger zone for NEC. So typically somewhere after 33 to 34 weeks. And if you're dialed in here, you probably know that not all babies fit that way. But on a population basis in our own NICU, that was the data we saw. So we transitioned off of donor milk around 34 weeks. For moms still providing their own milk, we usually try to have a conversation with them about their feelings about that and whether or not they would support that transition, or if they would like us, especially I find that moms who are struggling to provide any of their own milk. So moms that are at that point in their gestation, 34 weeks, where they are still struggling and they're providing less than 50% of their own milk. Some of those moms find it very emotionally devastating that now their baby's not going to get any donor milk at all, and that their dose of mom's own milk is at risk because baby's not getting donor milk anymore. But so typically around 34 weeks and what to transition to. I don't have a great answer for that. Everything from this point forward is strictly opinion. Depending on the gestation of the baby, you might be able to use, and the growth of the baby, you might be able to use unfortified breast milk if mom's is available. You might transition to a transitional formula or a 22 calorie formula. Of those available, Infocare is one of those things that has a weight to casein ratio that's slightly more like breast milk. So if you needed to choose one, that was less like formula and a small portion more like breast milk, that might be a good option. But there isn't research about that. We typically use a transitional formula or a preterm formula until they're actually achieving close to full PO, and then transition to a transitional formula.
We have another question in the chat box about sometimes a problem of higher rates of hypoglycemia and hyponatremia in infants that are in an all-human milk diet with milk fortifier, especially if they're extremely low birth weight babies. And so any particular strategies that you use in these cases where you're encountering hypoglycemia and hyponatremia?
I'm not sure about hypoglycemia, but certainly hyponatremia, I think that's fairly well documented, though I haven't seen case reviews about it. It is something that I see often. My suggestion would be that, it's a biologic that has a wide variety of micronutrient concentrations. So even feeding mom's own milk, you might get a baby who gets hyponatremic because her own milk print, the milk that she makes, has a range of sodium that is, 2 standard deviations lower than what would be biologically expected, and which would have been fine as a term baby, but now that she's had a preterm baby, it's not going to suffice. So I suggest that for high rates of feeding mother's own milk or donor milk, that you really should continue as these kids grow through their lower gestations into more preterm gestations around 32 to 33 weeks. You really should consider getting weekly lights. We check lights at least once a week until they're about that size, which seems a little bit excessive as they're on full feeds and there isn't, if it's happening early on, obviously you're still checking electrolytes, but if it's happening, you need to keep following them. And especially if you're worried that they're not growing well, it's possible that you're missing out on one of these micronutrients. So you probably should measure it in baby. And it's also controversial whether or not you actually supplement those micronutrients, whether you supplement sodium or potassium or chloride specifically. And there's not a great or best practice built around that yet at this point. I know there are some nurseries that feel like those medications are so hyperosmolar that they're not going to give them as enteral supplements. But some people do feel like if your sodium is 125, even though you're tolerating full feeds, you're not going to grow well. So a little bit of either sodium chloride or potassium chloride can help correct that over 3 to 5 days.
We have a question here that it's not, it's a little bit outside of the population we typically think of for NEC prevention, but the use of donor milk in the newborn nursery, or patients who are term in the NICU for that may, for example, treatment of hypoglycemia or as a full formula alternative in the non-very low birth weight population of infants. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that practice is growing for sure. Supplementation with donor milk in newborn nursery for hypoglycemia or for perceived low milk supply or for jaundice. I've seen that happen too. It's a practice that I would support now, mostly because there seems to be enough milk to go around. We were very worried, like I mentioned 8, 9, 10 years ago, that we weren't going to be able to fill orders for the NICUs who were specifically only using for very low birth weight babies. But over the years, we've had enough, and we've been able to fill those orders. But I guess the question is not just is it available, but should it be done? There is a tiny amount of evidence about using donor milk as a supplement, and does it in the newborn nursery, does it support mom to go on and then exclusively breastfeed her baby at home because she has the perception that donor milk maybe is a short-term thing and it's a medical intervention and not just a formula that you buy off the shelf at any CVS. And so there is some qualitative evidence that points to the fact that it may be emotionally supportive for those moms and that they may perceive it as something that is supportive of breastfeeding. Those are very small, and the actual randomized controlled trials haven't borne that out, but the qualitative studies look like it might be helpful. And it is, I would suggest, I guess, that if you were really considering it and you felt like using donor milk in its frozen form was a barrier, this might be a place in the newborn nursery to actually use some of that shelf-stable milk. It would be an easy way to, literally pull it off the shelf, and you might not have to go through all the process problems that are involved with frozen milk.
I also want to add that we have a little bit of information on our website about human milk use before heart surgery in infants with congenital heart disease and them having a lower risk of necrotizing enterocolitis if they've been exposed and received human milk. So you can check that on our website. It's under NEC facts and then cardiac NEC. And this is, like Erin said, there's not a whole lot of research and information out there, but we're working on building it.
And another question, I think this is maybe our last question, a nice segue to our next webinar series in December, which is on fortification. And I think the question is whether human milk fortifier, and I'm assuming based on this that it's a bovine fortifier, would that negate the protective effects of donor human milk against NEC in preterm babies? And this is something that I know we're going to touch on, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
Yeah, so the trials that you saw in the Cochrane review are actually all with bovine fortifier. So none of those are with human milk fortifier. There are, of course, there are some randomized controlled trials that include reduction of necrotizing enterocolitis, and that is included in some of those. So there's really only 2, I think, that included a exclusively human fortifier. And so at that point, you're looking at the degree of reduction of NEC, whether or not it is reduced by a larger amount by exclusively human diet might be the case based on some trials that might be true. But the majority of the research was done on bovine fortifier. So there does seem to be some protective effect even with bovine fortifier with donor milk.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. Are we good, Ravi, Erin?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. And we hope that you'll tune back in on December 18th when we explore fortifiers with Dr. Deborah O'Connor. And we will be getting the recording and hopefully the slides and the resources that we shared today up on our website in the next week or so. So stay tuned, and we look forward to being in touch.
Yeah, thank you.